Hey everybody and welcome back to the channel. In the previous video we looked at this Grape PC that I picked up that contained a virus, the stoned virus. In this video we're going to be exploring that stoned virus in a little bit more detail. We're going to go over what a bootsector virus is, how the stoned virus works, how it infects disks, and how it spreads from one computer to another. So brace yourselves as we're going to be going knee-deep into the muddy world of computer viruses and the stoned virus in particular. But first a word from our sponsor. And this video is sponsored by PCBWay, a full-feature custom PCB prototyping service. If you need PCB prototypes, SMD stencils, PCB assembly, flexible PCBs or advanced PCBs, PCBWay has got you covered. Shipping to more than 170 countries worldwide, processing thousands of PCB orders a day, PCBWay combines excellent pricing with excellent customer service. Check out their website to get a quote or get in touch with their friendly support staff if you have any more questions. So let's start by taking a look at the definition of a virus. And for that I went to Norton.com, known from Norton Antivirus, one of the most well-known antivirus software packages. And here it states that a computer virus is much like a flu virus, designed to spread from host to host with the ability to replicate itself. It is typically considered to be malicious or malevolent, written in such a way to alter the way that the computer operates. And also, very importantly, it is designed to spread from one computer to another. Now, most viruses have the potential to cause unexpected damaging effects, but not all viruses are like that. For example, the stoned virus is one of those viruses that falls into the harmless category, hence this video. Because we are talking about a virus that was written in the late 80s, a time when computers were still relatively new and people were still very much in the experimental phase of computers and had no real intent to do any harm with them. So what is the stoned virus exactly? Well, the stoned virus is a bootsector computer virus. Now, there's some debate on whether it originated in 1987 or 1988, but safe to say it is one of the earliest MS-DOS bootsector viruses around and made its way into Europe and was very common during the beginning of the 90s. Now, how did the stoned virus spread, you might ask? Well, all it took was one infected disk that was used to boot the computer from. And when that happened, the stoned virus would silently install itself both onto the hard drive of the computer and inside the memory of the computer, meaning that every subsequent disk that was used inside that computer would also get infected. And because floppy disks during that time period was the most popular means of portable storage, the stoned virus found its way on lots of computers. Because remember, every time you transferred an infected disk from one computer to another and you were able to boot off of that disk into the new computer would also be infected. Now, the stoned virus became widespread in the early 90s and a lot of variants of the virus started appearing, some of them becoming very prominent. Michelangelo, for example, and Angelina are often considered as the most important variants of the stoned virus. Now, in October of 1995, Seagate actually shipped 850 megabyte IDE hard drives, which were still factory sealed, which were found to contain the Angelina bootsector virus. In 2007, Medion laptops were sold by the Aldi retail chain in Germany and Denmark, which are also infected with the Angelina virus. The stoned virus even made its way into the blockchain, where certain payloads containing the stoned virus payload were detected and picked up by antivirus software. Now, the stoned virus is a bootsector virus, but what is a bootsector virus and what is a bootsector? Now, every time you turn on your computer, one of the very first things that the BIOS looks for is seeing how it could start an operating system. And the first place where the BIOS will look for that is the first sector of each storage device. So this can be your hard drive, or it can be a floppy drive you've inserted. And that first sector is called the boot sector. On a hard drive, this is referred to as the master boot record, and on a floppy disk, it's referred to as a boot sector. So let's start by looking at the boot sector of a floppy disk, because there are multiple ways of looking at a floppy disk. We can look at the physical medium like this, where we have stuff like the plastic housing, the index hole, the actual disk, the center hub, the write enable notch. That's one way of looking at a floppy disk, looking at the physical medium. Another way of looking at a floppy disk is what you actually see on your screen. You can see that, a floppy disk has a volume name, has a serial number, it might have folders, it might have files on them, and it has a certain capacity. Now, this is obviously the view that the operating system presents to you. This is not how the computer actually sees the disk. Because what the computer, or more specifically the floppy disk drive, is doing, it's actually using its heads to read off that magnetically coated plastic which is inside of your floppy disk. So let's open one up just to see what that looks like. And if we remove that kind of plastic housing inside of the floppy disk, you will actually see that magnetically, coated circular plasticky thing here. And this is where actually all of your data is located. Now, what we have on here is a set of tracks, and the tracks are basically concentric rings around the center of this disk. Now, obviously, you cannot see this with the naked eye, so here's a visual representation. We see the different tracks, and along the tracks we find different sectors. And sectors is basically a subdivision of a track on that magnetic disk. It is also the smallest unit of data that you will find on a disk, 512 bytes to be exact. Now, as your floppy disk drive is moving its head across the magnetic surface of the floppy disk, what it basically sees is something like this. Here you see the first 512 bytes of a floppy disk, and this is the boot sector. What you're seeing here is a hex editor which has loaded up a floppy disk image file, and I have selected the first 512 bytes. Now if we zoom in, what we're seeing here in the hex editor, we are basically seeing bytes. For example, EB is the hexadecimal representation of 1 byte. 34 is also the hex representation of 1 byte. So every 2 pairs that you see here is 1 byte. And the boot sector is effectively 512 of those bytes. Now, computers are used to working with zeros and ones. Now, a hex representation can also be represented as a series of zeros and ones, because 1 byte is 8 bits. So basically, the computer is seeing something like this. But because this isn't really easy on the eye, a hexadecimal representation is often used to represent these kind of binary formats, because it's a lot more condensed, it's easier to read, and you can see certain patterns in it. For example, here the pattern EB, 34, 90, 4D is something that you can actually remember, as opposed to 1100, 11111000. Now the same thing happens on a hard drive, only there the boot sector is often referred to as the master boot record. So let's open up one of those hard drives to see what we have inside. This is one which is broken, so it is safe to open it. I wouldn't recommend opening a working hard drive, but you see a pretty similar thing here. You see this circular thing here, which is magnetically coated, and it also contains the same concept. It has tracks and it has sectors. And the first sector which is encountered is referred to as the master boot record. Same thing as on a floppy drive. Also 512 bytes in size. Okay, so a little word on boot sectors. Now the boot sector is used for the computer to basically load up the operating system. The fact that I was able to boot into MS-DOS 3.30 from a floppy disk here is the responsibility of the computer BIOS loading up the boot sector on this floppy disk. And even non-bootable floppy disks have a boot sector. You're probably familiar with this type of text. If you ever left a disk on your computer, you've probably seen this non-system disk or disk error. Replace and press any key when ready. Now this is not the computer making up this text. This is actually encoded into the boot sector of the floppy disk. For example, if I format a floppy disk here in a virtual machine and I give it a volume label, if we then take a look at the boot sector which is generated for this floppy disk, you can see the first 512 bytes. You can see the label here. You can see the non-system disk or disk error message, which will be displayed when you try to boot from this floppy, because this is not a bootable floppy. Now, how does it all start? Now, imagine your PC is clean and virus-free. How do you get stoned on there? Now, to understand how stoned works, we need to talk about patient 0. And patient 0 is the first infected floppy disk that you insert in your computer and boot from. When your computer boots from such an infected floppy disk, the stoned virus comes to life. First, it becomes resident in the memory of the computer without you knowing about it. And second, as we have booted from a floppy disk, Stone will have already infected the master boot record of your hard drive. This makes it really handy for Stone to infect other disks in the future, as patient 0 is no longer needed. Stone has installed itself on your hard drive, so every time you boot the computer from the hard drive, Stone is automatically loaded into memory and can start infecting other disks. This will turn your PC effectively into a super spreader, so basically every disk that will be accessed on this PC will now get infected. So how does the Stone virus infect other floppies? Well, so let's say your computer was infected with the Stone virus. And you have a clean disk here, which definitely doesn't contain any viruses. As soon as you insert this clean disk into an infected computer, and as soon as the computer starts accessing that drive, that disk will also get infected. As you can see, if I take my supposedly clean floppy disk and I insert it into my Athlon XP computer here, as soon as I try to access it, let me go to the B drive, I am immediately notified that a virus is detected. So that just goes to show how easy it is to get from a clean floppy disk to a stoned infected disk. So how does that work? So let's look at our non-infected floppy disk, which is just an MS-DOS 3.30 boot disk. If we look at the first 512 bytes, the boot sector, we see the standard MS-DOS 3.3 boot sector. So this is the non-infected boot sector, starting with EB3494D. Now, after the infection, you will notice that the first 512 bytes of this disk have changed, because now we have the infected boot sector from the Stone virus here. And this one starts with EA0500C0. So this is the stoned virus boot sector. And you can also find the same one on Wikipedia, because it has this nice little screenshot here showing you the hex dump of the stoned virus. But that's not all that it did, because if we go back to the non-infected boot sector, starting with EB3490, now if we go back to our infected floppy boot sector, we see the stoned virus here. But more interestingly, as we scroll down the disk and we hit hexadecimal value 1600 or byte offset 5632, we actually see a copy of our original MS-DOS 3.3 boot sector. So Stone basically copied the original bootloader onto sector 11 of this floppy disk. So the Stone boot sector is at sector 0, and it just copied the original boot sector onto sector 11. Now, what happens if you have a PC which is already infected by the Stone virus, or you're booting from a floppy disk which is infected by the Stone virus? Well, a lot of the times nothing will happen. Your computer will simply boot. You will not notice that either your computer is infected or that you're booting from a floppy disk which is infected. And that's the nifty thing about the Stone virus. It doesn't harm your computer, it just silently installs itself on either the master boot record of your hard drive or it installs itself into memory, waiting to infect other disks and replicate itself. But now, every once in a blue moon, you will get the infamous "your PC is now stoned" message. Well, it's 1 out of 8 boot cycles, to be exact, that you get a chance to get this message, informing you that your PC is infected. But that's the only thing that the stoned virus does. Once in a while it displays this message, and it just replicates itself to other disks and computers. Now, how do you know if you or your computer are stoned? Now, remember how I showed you the stoned virus boot sector here in this hex editor? Well, we can basically do the same from an MS-DOS session on our XT machine. So let's take a look. In order to do that, we need to have the program debug that normally ships with MS-DOS. So upon hitting debug, you will get a prompt. And one of the first things we'll do now is we'll load up the boot sector from our floppy disk, and we'll store it on the local memory 100. Now, if I then dump the 128 bytes starting from position 280, you will see the final text of the boot sector of the stoned virus. If I load up sector 11 from the floppy disk, you will see the original MS-DOS 3.3 boot sector. So we first have the stoned virus boot sector, and then hidden away in sector 11, we have the MS-DOS 3.3 boot sector. Now, any decent antivirus software will also be able to detect the stoned virus. For example, here this fprot antivirus program, which is about a total of 3 megabytes, I think, so is definitely workable on an XT computer, is capable of finding the stoned virus boot sector infection and is also able to repair it. Now, we've talked about patient 0, the first infected disk that you insert. But what if you don't have such an infected disk, or if you don't have an infected PC? How do you start creating patient 0? Well, it appears that we have all the tools available to do so. Now, keep in mind, what I'm about to show you will create a boot disk which will in fact contain the stoned virus. Now, the fact that it only works on 360K 5¼ inch floppies greatly reduces the attack vector of this virus, but be aware of the fact that you will be creating a stoned virus floppy disk here. Now, all we need is a bootable floppy disk. We need to have the binary version of the stoned virus, which is 512 bytes, and we need the debug command. So what we're going to do is we're going to be starting the debug command, which ships with MS-DOS, and we'll see what we can do with that. One of the first things that we want to do is we want to go ahead and locate the boot sector of our floppy. So I'm going to load it into memory segment 100, and I'm just going to dump it now so that I can see the actual bootloader. So here you can see the MS-DOS 3.3 bootloader from my clean disk, as you already saw in the hex editor. So it's the same thing using the debug tool in MS-DOS. Now remember, the stoned virus copies the original boot sector to sector 11 of the floppy. And that's what we're going to be doing now. So again, using the debug session, we're going to be executing a couple of commands here that will basically copy the boot sector to the new location on sector 11 of the floppy disk. So we're going to be writing a little bit of assembly here. We're going to call interrupt 13, return, hit enter, and then type G to execute our little assembly program. So the program terminated normally. We can quit the debug session, and we can verify that our original boot sector on the floppy disk is still present. So we're going to load up the boot sector in memory segment 100 using the load command. And then I'm just going to dump the content. Here we have it. Our original MS-DOS 3.3 boot loader or boot sector unchanged. And now I am going to navigate all the way to sector 11. I'm going to load up segment 1600, which is sector 11. And you will see that our MS-DOS 3.3 bootloader now is copied onto that sector. So now that we've safely copied our boot sector onto sector 11, it's time to load up our stoned boot sector and write that in the boot sector of the floppy. So we're going to be using this command here, and that will write the content, the 512 bytes in this stoned.bin file, and write it to sector 0 of our floppy. So we can now verify it. So let's load up the first sector from the floppy and dump it. And here we should see the "your PC is stoned" boot text. We also see legalize marijuana. This is something which is in the stoned virus code, but it's never shown on screen. And here on sector 11, we see the original MS-DOS boot sector. Now, because the stoned virus is a pretty popular boot sector virus, there are many articles and documents online where you can see the actual code of the stoned virus. One in particular I would recommend is the one from Peter Kleischner, which has, you know, this kind of documented source code of the stoned virus. So if you're into assembler and you want to see what the virus is actually doing on a low level, definitely check that out. There's also this nice GitHub page that I'll also link, containing a full documented source code of the stoned virus. And with that, we've reached the end of this video and this little tour of the stoned virus. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up or subscribe to the channel if you like this type of content. I really have enjoyed my time with this PC and the virus so far. The only thing that I still have to do is to see if I can revive the faulty hard drive which is in the system, and see if I can get some cool XT software on this thing up and running again. But until then, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you guys very soon. Bye bye.